etc.
Or a technology background, something like that. So you might not know a lot of this. But also because in the public discourse and in general in society, we see so many assumptions about history. And I'm going to illustrate them with my favorite stock photos of what historians and girl historians can do. And so some of these assumptions, which I would say are all wrong, but really common, is that history is in books. History is facts, and we know the facts. There is a true and obvious historical narrative that we know, and that doing history is learning this, is learning about the past, rather than, say, discovering things about the past. So I'm going to illustrate with some examples from the wild. Things when I get a bit annoyed, I take screenshots, and now I can finally use these for something. And the first is this one about a very popular podcast called The Rest is History. And this is just a randomly chosen headline that says that history professors struggle to get students excited about the past. Yet, at a recent live show, the hosts of the Rest is History podcast drew a raucous Gen Z audience with a rock concert vibe. And this is an example of something you see really often, which is this idea that doing history academically is just taking in knowledge about the past. And it's kind of implying that listening to a podcast is the same as going to university and doing history. And if one can be raucous and fun, why can't the other? And academics do it too, and this is from a study where some computer scientists wanted to test whether an AI chatbot would do better than random answers in a multiple choice test in history, which it couldn't. And so they said this in an interview, that they thought bots would do better. History is often viewed as facts, but sometimes interpretation is necessary to make sense of it. And it's not very much more to say about this, and it seems so obvious to them that history is just facts that they designed their study around it. And the next example is of something quite different, which is the belief that we can't actually know anything about history. And so it's from Ridley Scott, who a couple of years ago made this film, Napoleon, and he was criticized for not being historically accurate, which isn't the point here, that's totally fine. But when he was confronted with this in an interview, he wanted to explain why he doesn't care about this kind of criticism. And so he said that 400 years later, so after Napoleon's death, there's a lot of imagination in history books. When I have issues with historians, when I have issues with historians, I ask, "Excuse me, mate, were you there? No? Well, shut the F up then." And this is a surprisingly common assumption, which is that there's not actually that much expertise involved. If you can read the history books, then you can do history. Saying socially that historians are doing what he's doing. They're coming up with things. They're making fiction in the way that he's making fiction. And as I'm sure you know, there's a political dimension to this as well. So here's a quote from Kemi Badenoch, who's currently the leader of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. And she said a couple of years ago that the only people who are stoking culture wars are the people who are trying to change what is written in our history books and what's in our museums. And that's a clear example of a really common thing, which is this subconscious thinking that there is actually a true historical narrative, And that happens to be what she learned in school. And she's not thinking about the fact that her parents learned something different in school and her grandparents learned something different from that again. And then she's also, she's thinking that just because the past doesn't change, history can't change. History is just the way we talk about the past. And my favorite example, which is a very recent executive order from the president of the US. There you go. It's called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. And it opens by saying that Americans have witnessed a concerted and widespread effort to rewrite our nation's history, replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology rather than truth. And there's nothing implicit here at all. It's just saying all these assumptions straight out. They're objective facts, there is a truth, we know the truth, and everything else is just politically motivated distortion. So when I see this, I think that maybe historians haven't done a good job of explaining what we actually do. I'm not sure it would help Trump very much if we tried to explain that, but I think as a society, it might help us understand all these clashes that we keep having about the past. So often when historians talk about methodology, we talk about it on a more theoretical or philosophical level. So there's a lot of French literary critics and epistemologies. So I thought I would try a different approach, which is to talk about what we actually do on a day-to-day basis. And I'm just going to use an example from my own research. And so, my case that I'm going to talk about is about this text here, which is the Laws of King Ina of Wessex. So in the 7th century, when this king was reigning, there was no such thing as England. So it was made up of many different kingdoms. And Wessex is a kingdom in the south of England. And around the 690s, this king wrote a law text, which you see here. It only survives in a copy that's about 200 years later, so from around 900. And this text is written in Old English. So Old English is the ancestor of modern English. It's different enough that you wouldn't be able to just pick up a text and read it. And it was in use from around 500 to sort of 1200, and then it started to develop into something we'd call Middle English. And important to note, this will become important later, that pretty much all laws in this period in England were written in Old English. And I was reading this text actually from a printed edition, so this is what historians typically would do. So here I get lots of different manuscripts, so I can compare all the different texts that exist and so on. And I was reading this to look for punishment practices. I wanted to know what kinds of penalties do you get for what kinds of crimes in the 7th century in England. And doing that, I came across this phrase here, which is "swelta sedel." That's not supposed to be a joke, but so this means to let someone die by death, which is a very strange phrase. I happen to know that it's from this Latin phrase, morte moriatur, which means the same, let him die by death. It's ultimately from a Hebrew construction, because this is a biblical word. So it's used often in the Christian Bible. If someone goes against God, they might find themselves dying by death. And I thought this is really weird in my law code, which has nothing to do with the Bible. It's not particularly religious. Nothing else about the language would suggest that this belongs in this text at all. So I needed to find out how it ended up there, basically. And my first port of call was this tool, the Old English corpus. This is a searchable web corpus of essentially all extant Old English, so everything that has survived. It's around 4 million words, so it's not very much, but that's all we have. And this told me what I already suspected, which is that this is a biblical term. It's essentially only used in the Bible or texts quoting the Bible in Old English. So that, again, just made me confirm this idea that it had no place being in my text at all. So I had to figure out, how did this phrase end up here? Considered some possibilities, ended up with this one. That my text, which you remember is 200 years, the actual surviving manuscript is 200 years older than the text itself, is a translation. So what we have is translation into Old English from an original that was written in Latin. So this would make it the only Latin law text that exists from this period in England. So it's a sort of unusual suggestion, but not impossible. And here I have to mention that in medieval history, we have no proofs of anything. We never, almost never, can we prove anything. So we're looking for clues and evidence and constructing some kind of plausible case, but nothing can be proven. So I thought that if I could find lots of traces of Latin, like lots of Latinisms in this text, then that might provide a plausible case. So then I set out finding traces of Latin by looking for things that stood out, like that first phrase, something that didn't seem to belong, or where other translators can't agree on how to translate something, or where the laws didn't make any legal sense, or where linguists point out unusual grammar. And I found a bunch of alternatives or options, things that could be from Latin, and so I investigated them all by turn. I'll just give you a few examples of some of the things I found. So we have this word here, church, which translates into cauldron or bowl, specifically as used for the ordeal, which is a medieval legal process. It's too complicated to explain right now, but if you want to ask me later, I'm happy to tell you what it is. And this word stands out and has stood out to most translators of this text because it's really unusual. And it also stands out because it's essentially only used in translations. So this I can get from the Dictionary of Old English. And dictionaries, historical dictionaries, tell you a lot more than just the definition of a word. They also tell you how often it's used, and it gives you lots of quotations from actual texts that have used this word. And these are all translations. It's even translated in a text that was translated by the same people who I had thought had translated my laws. So this suggests to me that this is not a term that a native speaker would use naturally, but I wanted to confirm that. Basically, I wanted to know if this is an idiomatic term. And that's really hard in a dead language because you can't ask any native speakers what words they would use. But we can use something like the Old English thesaurus. So a thesaurus, you don't search for words, you search for concepts and meanings. And then the thesaurus tells you what words are used to express those concepts. So here I've searched for the ordeal, and then I can see this is just a selection of the things that speakers of Old English have used to talk about the ordeal. And you can also click through and see how often each of these are used. And as it turns out, my term is only used in my text to talk about the ordeal. It's very unusual, and there are many other ways that are much more idiomatic if you want to talk about the ordeal in Old English. So at this point, it looked to me to be translationese. So a word that a translator is likely to reach for in response to a particular word, but not something that a native speaker is likely to use unprompted. I then wanted to figure out what the Latin original might have been, kind of back translating it into Latin. And I could actually look at the dictionary because when it gives you a quotation, it often tells you what the original is, if something is a translation. So here I find the Latin word aeneus, which then I thought might be a reasonable guess, since this was the text translated by the same people. I could look this up in a dictionary. This one is a dictionary of Latin, specifically in the Middle Ages, specifically in the British Isles. And what this tells me is that my term was used in Latin by a person who's an advisor of my king. So that tells me that this word is current. They know this word in England, and they're using this word in England at this time. But to get even more confirmation of that, I use this one, which is the cross-database search tool. So it's a collection of different Latin corpora. So you can search in Latin texts from antiquity up until the 18th century, and it's not exhaustive because there's so much Latin surviving, but it gives you a pretty good impression. And you can limit the search. So I've limited here to early medieval law specifically, and this is just a variant spelling of my word. And so here I see that this word is used to talk about the ordeal in a phrase exactly like mine in laws from the 7th century, but from what is modern day France and Germany. And these laws would have been known in England as well. So the upshot is that the Old English seemed unidiomatic. The Latin was likely to have been used in this context and at this time. And then I can't explain all of it, but there's also other traces of Latin constructions in the same sentence where this appears. So I thought it was a good bit of evidence. And other bits were a bit more straightforward. So there's a sentence that uses this term, guilty, which means guilty, which should have been using this word, skyldig, which means guilty, but also liable for. So to be liable for a compensation payment or fine. And it could be explained by a translator who failed to translate the correct meaning of the Latin word culpabilis. So it should have translated the meaning liable for, but went for guilty instead. There's also this word here, hereteam, which translates into something like someone who gathers an army. It doesn't make much sense, and it's been a very hard word to actually translate. And the dictionary makers had to come up with a definition for it that doesn't match the words at all. But it's much more convincingly explained as an awkward translation of a particular verb construction that's really common in Latin, but that doesn't exist in Old English. So I find these ones, I find a lot more detail to each of these ones as well. And there's also evidence that these things stemmed from translation rather than just sort of influence from Latin. And some of the clues are stronger than others, but combined, I thought that it was quite clear that this text isn't quite what it seems to be. But then, as it says here, linguistic evidence isn't enough. If you're trying to make a plausible case in history, you also have to establish a historical context. And so for me, that meant I had to find out whether anyone had the means and the motive and the opportunity to translate this text and to write it in Latin in the first place in the 7th century. Because as I said, this wasn't really a done thing. And reading for historical context is you have to be really broad. So obviously this touches on the use of Old English, the use of Latin, translation theory, and the legal system, these kinds of things. But you also have to read about trade and travel in Europe, about the value of specific silver coins that are discussed in this text, about tenant farmers in the Roman Empire, about heresy in the Byzantine Empire. You have to read a lot if you want to establish a plausible historical context. In my case, it was clear that there were people who had the skill to write a text in Latin, a complicated text in Latin in England in the 7th century. And there are people who had a pretty good reason to do so as well. And there are people who had the means and the opportunity and the motive to do it, the translation in the 900s. And there are also some suspects we could identify. So named individuals who are likely to have been part of the writing of the text in Latin, and also who are likely to have taken part in the translation in the 9th century. So you remember that I don't deal with proofs or anything, but starting from this bit of language and establishing this historical context, I declared it a plausible case. But the work isn't done there. So the hardest day-to-day task of a historian, and it should be a day-to-day task, is to ask, so what? Why does any of this matter to anyone? And answering that question, if you can, involves putting your work into a much bigger context. So a longer time period, or a contentious debate, or a grand narrative. And this case touches on quite a few grand narratives, but the most important one is a story about English exceptionalism in law and constitution. So this is a really long-lasting idea that England's ancient constitution, which is an unwritten constitution, has ensured a particularly English type of freedom and liberty and sovereignty, which is better than elsewhere. And it's always been important in this story to talk about the oldest laws, like the laws of Ina. And it's been important that these laws were written in English, because English was the language of the people, and that's where the freedom came from. Latin is the language of the church and the language of Roman law, and it's the language that represents external influence in England. And the fact that the laws were written in English has always been seen as one of many things that set England apart from all its European neighbours in this period, because they mostly wrote their laws in Latin. So the idea is that England always followed its own path, even before England was a country, and that path is characterized by England being free from European influence, which in the Middle Ages would mean Roman law and the Catholic Church, or as today, free from EU law and EU regulations. You see here that you can free yourself from the clutches of the EU. And so it's not only shaped politics and the way we talk about politics, but it's such a long-lasting grand narrative that has shaped some very fundamental assumptions that historians still work with, even if they're not kind of consciously ascribing to a lot of these things. And my study doesn't change any of that at all, but the important thing is that it's one of many studies in recent years that are kind of chipping away at this grand narrative. England isn't quite as unique or as isolated as that grand narrative would tell us. And this then is an example of how history develops or how we rewrite history. It's not by twisting the truth to fit an agenda or replacing facts with fictions. It's about creating new knowledge, things that people didn't know before. And it's important to know that it's possible to get new knowledge about the past, even without discovering new texts or discovering new artifacts and things like that. Because the new knowledge actually comes from new assumptions and new people in the field and new tools. But I think most importantly, new questions. So I hope to have shown that the tools, which I know are like hopelessly low tech for a lot of you, but for historians, this has changed a lot about how we work. You can do things that you couldn't do before, and that will probably be the case in the future as well. We get even more advanced tools that we can manage to use. But if you use those tools to answer the same questions informed by the same prejudices and the same preconceptions, then I don't think they would be as meaningful at all. That's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, now we're going to do some Q&A. Yeah, so sorry, microphone tutorial. Hold on, I'm walking past the speakers. Meet me for a second. So, okay, so, whoa, a little less hot. So the way you hold this microphone, this is YouTube style, okay? So hold it light, a little light, points at your mouth, offline, so you don't your P's, and about a hand's width distance from your mouth. Yeah, for technical reasons, we can't use the regular microphones tonight. So just sort of keep it around here and not directly in front of your mouth. So anyone got a question? And is not intimidated by the mic? Thank you. Okay. Always mute me when I'm crossing the speaker.
So let's see, where's the green part? The green light faces me. Okay. So Ingrid, thanks. That was a great talk. I learned a bunch from it. The dictionary that you were talking about that translates from Old English and the older and older languages, who initiated that? How old is it? And how did they put it together?
Yeah, so the dictionary is a project based in Toronto. It's actually only up to L, so you should only learn about those words. It started in the 70s, and so the corpus was gathered or started to be the basis for the dictionary. So to make a historical dictionary, obviously you have to gather all the quotations that exist of any one word and use them to figure out what the meaning is. So started off with index cards, and now has been digitized and is searchable.
So that itself doesn't go back hundreds of years.
There are dictionaries, obviously, that are much older than that, yeah. So the oldest dictionaries will be from the 16th, 17th century. But the online dictionaries are only, well, I mean, obviously not from the 70s, but this modern dictionary is from the 70s. So before that, I think it would be in the 1820s was the dictionary that existed before this one existed. I think.
Cool, thanks.
Cool. I think, Rod, you should just pick the next answer and just go like that.
All right, who's got another question? All right, got back here.
Like that? No? Is that okay? Yeah, okay, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering, like, as a historian, when you look at this material and it's kind of, there's like a lot of potential directions you can go and interpretations you can make of it. Mm-hmm. And you're trying to like, okay, maybe rewrite history or change the narrative into a certain direction. how do you like stay objective and like control for your own personal biases in that situation, or do you do anything to like account for that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big kind of theoretical debate in history. It's called presentism. Like, how should you deal with exactly that problem? So you can't escape it. It comes through your own brain, which is shaped by what it's shaped by. And so, I mean, just like any other academic effort, basically, just have integrity. Like, you should interrogate your own choices. You should interrogate your own questions and your own answers. But in some ways, the presentism is what gets us further as well. Because if our assumptions of new people and new generations didn't influence our work, then we wouldn't get anywhere else. So it's a balance to be had for sure. And I think, you know, this maybe isn't as easy for others to see, but there are strong and weak historical cases, right? So even if you are very much influenced by your own convictions, your case can still be waterproof. So that's where you're aiming for. And yeah. But it's definitely an important theoretical debate that we're having quite often.
Thank you.
Thank you. Like this? Sorry. So thank you so much for the presentation. My question is like, how recent can this work be done? Like, let's say we're talking about something very old, but can you do this? Like, should you do this something like in the 90s or something? Even like, let's say like the COVID years. Are you doing like? Are there historians doing this kind of analysis?
I mean, people probably could have done this in the 19th century. Because in the 19th century, historians weren't often not employed at universities, and they often could spend 30 years on a project, and they would have this in their heads. So similar things have been done long before we had computers to help us with it. If that's what you were
I mean, like, let's say recently. So let's say like, is someone doing work like this? Like, oh, how we see the 90s.
Oh, I see. Right.
The 90s like now.
Yeah,
like,
I see.
20 years ago.
Yeah. As in,
Sorry.
As in the reinterpretation, you mean? Or
Are the people saying like, oh, like the records that we have at the time actually don't reflect because there were certain bias that now we see that they are wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'd very much see that. So, I mean, the 90s, I think, is counted as history now, but it's only like a couple of years ago since I heard about anyone going to a 1990s conference. So that's probably like right at the modernist of modern history. But yeah, no, I mean, talk about the 70s and 80s, that would probably have gone through several kind of paradigms of interpretation by now. It can change quite quickly, but it depends on what you're talking about. It's like some of these grand narratives are much grander and have become much more ingrained in thinking. And then other narratives will be slightly easier to change if you want to change them, for example. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
That was actually my question. I'll pivot a bit. So it feels like a lot of your work, a lot of the work of historians is sort of forensic historical sense making, is similar to the team at Know Your Meme, kind of deconstructing, you know,
Say that again.
Know Your Meme.
Know Your Meme. Okay, yeah.
So, you know, similar to the question before, do you see future historians as, you know, maybe Know Your Meme members researching, trying to sense make what the hell people were talking about, like running through the same tools of like, whatever, all that.
Yeah, surely. I mean, I feel bad for people who have to go through the amount of sources that's going to survive. This is why I'm a medieval historian, because we have a manageable number of sources, and there's a lot more imagination and a lot more creative thinking involved in medieval history. But yeah, exactly that. I mean, to figure out whether something is idiomatic, if something is colloquial and current, and these things will be exactly those kinds of sources, which we sometimes get from medieval history. We get things that are clearly normal people talking to other normal people and joking around and things like that. So
just to follow on that, are there any active dictionaries happening right now to sort of catalog, the same way that you have these idiomatic Latin, sorry, I'm losing my English here, databases?
Yeah.
Is there an active ongoing project to sort of catalog the current time in history so that for the future, people can have this as a resource?
I mean, yes, but I'm going to guess it's maybe not the work of historians, but probably something more like Time Machine and these kinds of things. But I mean, there are historical data sets that people are gathering about the very recent past, for sure. But I don't think anyone has the resources to gather up this much, basically. I mean, history research is very poorly funded, and especially if you want to use digital tools, then suddenly you have to have much, much more funding than you do just to fund a couple of historians. So I don't actually know, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people actually starting work on it anyway.
Thank you.
Just one comment, bouncing the question of the prior person. Is the Wayback Machine actually that current time database?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not the right person to answer this at all, but yeah. Yeah, do you want an answer?
It's more a comment
Yeah.
actually than
Good,
question,
good,
but
good.
yes.
Yeah, it's 2,000 years too late for me.
Where is it going?
Is there a line that we can draw between the law that you study and English law as it's practiced today? As you mentioned, there is this narrative about sort of the unwritten English constitution that has evolved over centuries, but can you actually identify like elements of English common law in the body of law that you study?
Yeah, basically no. So English common law is based on precedent, and in theory you can look back at medieval laws if you wanted to. There's a cutoff around 1300. So in the kind of strict sense, no, you can't. I know that my law was cited in the US Senate in the late 19th century. But up until, so Anglo-Saxon laws were cited frequently in Parliament during the Reformation in England, for example, because they were used as examples of a time where the Catholic Church had no power and the Parliament was very powerful, these kinds of things. So they've been used, but not in deciding cases. They've been used politically, basically. But no, you wouldn't see any traces of this, often because it deals with very different things, basically.
Okay.
Light.
Thank you so much. This is working? Oh, thank you. Phenomenal lecture. It was very interesting. I was just thinking about when it comes to data, how that's transmitted to people for the end user, so to speak, how it's consumed is quite important. And I found everything quite fascinating. I imagine if you've opened the textbook, I'm thinking of the example like the First Punic War. It's just a very strict, this happened, and Carthage marched into Sicily, and then Rome intervened, for example. How would you, for a lot of people who really want simple answers to things, unfortunately, how would you go about trying to package the information that you work on to transmit to people if you were to write a textbook or something or teach a class about it or anything like that?
So you mean for general audience or for...
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is why it's quite hard because as in all subjects, the studies we do are about very small details, and not all of those small details are interesting to other people or relevant for other people. But in this particular case, I think there's a very interesting story that might be interesting to more people about how Europe looked, and especially northwest of Europe looked after the Roman Empire fell. So we have, this is another really big grand narrative about the complete breakdown in everything after the fall of the Roman Empire. So Britain was part of the Roman Empire until 400. And we often have this idea that after that, it's the Dark Ages. And that's a narrative that's ripe for changing. And historians wouldn't talk about the Dark Ages, but people still do. And I think the narrative about travel and communication and connectedness across all of Europe, in fact, in this period is something that this kind of research might translate into for a more general audience. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I think it was a
Yeah.
good answer. Thank you.
okay, thanks.
Another question while we're on this side of the room with the microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. You said it's very hard to prove anything. So how are disputes between historians handled? So if another one has a competing theory, what do you do?
It's on the dance floor usually at the disco on our main conference. No. Yeah, exactly. So that's where it comes back to that plausible case. You can make many plausible cases for the Middle Ages. It depends on what you're trying to argue, where you're starting from, what sources you're using. And so we have, there's just lots of debates that aren't kind of solved, in that there are many people who would argue quite radically different things. And the further back you go in the Middle Ages, not including the ancient world, the harder that is. So I just talked about the period after the fall of the Roman Empire. You can find people who say vastly different things about why the Roman Empire fell, for example, and what the role was of these different populations in Europe. I mean, you don't do anything other than just try and make your case even more plausible. Change your mind if you should change your mind. But yeah, there's no right or wrong way to solve a historical debate, and some of them will never be solved. It's just in the nature of the game. We don't have sources for everything, so some answers will never be answered, basically.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. As a historian, what do you think about the phrase that history is written by victors?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense when you think about history that is written consciously as history. So when someone writes a chronicle or a history book about their contemporary time or their recent time, yeah, sure. But what most historians look at isn't written for the purpose of telling anyone about the past. It's written for the other purposes. It's written as tax records, or as not written at all. It's like a spoon in the ground, you know. So history, history books are written by the victors. What we use to construct our history narratives is not.
Thank you.
I'm audible. Yeah, okay. So actually, I wanted to add on that, like, history is written by victors, but it's published by publishers. So my question, like you briefly mentioned the idea of like translationies, where translators add on their own ideas. But I was reading this article which said like your favorite authors are your favorite authors because the publishers of their time like those authors as well. So it's possible that there might be contradicting information from that time. So you mentioned like for medieval sources, there are not a lot of sources to look at. And there's a possibility of implicit bias from like the publisher or whatever. So how do you deal with that, if at all?
So what do you mean by publisher? And I guess just
So
understand.
like, let's say during the time of Shakespeare, if there was like other writers or like authors or whatever, but their ideas were not necessarily well received by publishers or like whoever.
Right, I see what you mean.
So how do you deal with that?
So if I understand you correctly, so it would be kind of who decides that something makes it into writing in the first place. Yeah. Yeah, so in the Middle Ages, that's obvious. Everything we have from the Middle Ages is massively skewed by the fact that few people could write, and the people who could write were church people, typically, and very high-level elites. So in some sense, yeah, we're only seeing, in written texts, we're mostly seeing a very partial view of society right at the top. But in terms of publishing, there's no such thing as publishing, which is the other good thing. If you had a bit of parchment and some ink, which you might not, because you have to kill a cow and everything to get parchment. But anyone could write anything, and we could still have it. So in some sense, it's not like you're being kept from publishing what you wanted in the way that you could be at other periods. Sorry, I don't know if that was a good answer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That question, then we got one here, and I think that's where we're going to stop. Okay?
Now everybody is making history in the social media, and everybody is making the new languages. Recently, I watched TikTok, and a younger teenager making new Japanese language, and I couldn't understand. So, in my understanding, your presentation is about there's no continuity in the history, languages, or any other culture or knowledge. But the human races have its identity with the knowledge or history or languages or any other information. So what happened now? So many disinformation, I don't know, so many narratives in social media.
Right, I see.
And there's no continuity from the history.
Do you mean how do you pick out what is disinformation and what is, as a historian, is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. No, I'm again I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. I think it's about, this is a really important lesson actually for medieval history, because we have a tendency to think that the further back in time we go, the more unified everyone's thinking was. So everyone thinks that in the Middle Ages, this was like that, forgetting that we're talking about millions of people over the course of hundreds of years. And it will be the same in interpreting what's happening now as a historical source, is remembering that one idea could exist among a big group of people or a small group of people or a single person, and trying to always bear that in mind as a historian, that sources don't represent everyone.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. Could you?
Really interesting. My question actually kind of falls off the last one. Kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about how you, not when you just like, you talked about translations and trying to find information that was kind of lost, and you're recovering that or reinterpreting that. Kind of curious on the opposite end, if you have conflicting sources of information, what do you like, what's your process of like kind of figuring out what to follow or what you think is more plausible than the other?
Yeah, so typically you would start by looking for just more sources, obviously. So this is kind of where the modern way of doing history comes from, is realizing that you can't rely on any one source. You need to have as many as possible. I guess it's so hard to talk about because you shouldn't talk about the bias of the source because it confuses students. But you just have to assess the reasons why something was produced and who produced it. And would that give you any reason to think that what they're telling you is not, well, I don't want to say true, but is maybe it's for something else, right? None of these things were written to give us information. It was written for other purposes. So you have to assess why something was made. And then that gets you a bit closer to understanding whether it's a useful source for what you are trying to answer. Sometimes sources are just conflicting, often on issues of fact. So it's quite common that we can't date a particular medieval battle, or we can't know exactly where it took place. These kinds of things, there's lots of conflicting sources about. And in that case, you just have to leave it, unless you can kind of verify in other sources, but a lot of the time you can't. So, but if it's on the more kind of interpretative level, then yeah, you have to do source criticism and then take that into your interpretation of that source.
Okay, super. So Ingrid, thank you so much. Can everyone
Thank you so
give
much.
Ingrid a big hand? And we're gonna take back at 9:15, so 20-minute break.
This is the last call for the bar, so stock up.
Last call for the bar, indeed. Okay, thank you. You can mute my mic now.
La 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 la. Oh my god, okay, it's going public. It's wee wah wee wah wee wah wee Okay, yeah.
Check, check. Okay, folks, if you could please start making your way back to your seats so we can get started with the second half of the show. If someone could go wave at the people who are outside and ask them to come back in as well. Thank you, Rod. I was going to get there eventually. Months and months more of campaigning before the general election in November. So all of this takes an enormous amount of time and effort. Your registration is not automatic. And I've been told that perhaps as partly because of this, the vast majority of Americans in Japan don't vote. Now, maybe some of you are Americans, and I hope that you're already voting. I hope that all of you have American friends. What I'm going to ask of you right now is, if you're not registered to vote and you're an American citizen, start looking up how to do it. And if you know any Americans, that you stop just complaining to them about our current government. You keep doing that. I'm fine with that, believe me. But also start bothering to find out if they're registered or not, if their registration is up to date, if they've requested their ballot online, if they know what they need to do, because it all takes a lot of time. And if you're going to vote in the primaries, if you're going to vote in the general election, you have to start thinking about it now. So that was my spiel for the end of the night. I think we've got that out of the way. And if you, by the way, if you want any cards, this website, votefromabroad.org, is run by the Democrats abroad, which is part of the Democratic Party. But regardless of your political inclinations, they will show you how to vote from abroad. And I have some cards to hand out if anyone wants to throw a card at an American friend or something like that. Okay, I think that we are ready. Are we ready? Andrew, are we ready? We're ready. All right, and thank you for listening to my little speech, and you only have to hear it 8 more times or so before the election. And yes, I am registered. All right, our next speaker is returning for his second talk at Nerd Nite, Bektur Ryskeldiev. Dr. Bektur Ryskeldiev is a Kyrgyzstani-born researcher and creative technologist working in spatial computing, human-computer interaction, immersive media, and digital art. He is a senior research scientist at Mercury R4D Labs and a longtime educator, organizer, and content producer at SIGGRAPH. Previously at the University of Scuba's Digital Nature Group, he investigated how handheld and wearable technologies change the ways that we interact and perceive each other online. His work has appeared at ACM SIGGRAPH Asia. Is it CHI or CHI? I'm not sure, but CHI, CSCW, IEEE VR, and Augmented Human. He has founded and contributed to tech, art, and science communities worldwide, including one of Tokyo's first AI and XR hackathons and Mutech JP AI Music Lab. Please welcome Bektur Ryskeldiev.
Thank you. All right. Are those my slides, by the way? Because there's like only 16 slides.
Oh.
Can you?
Sorry, I keep forgetting that we have to switch up here.
Yep.
That was a close one.
Is it?
Yeah, sorry, this is not my
all good
usual computer. So yeah.
Yep. All right, cool. Hi everyone, good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm happy to see a lot of friends here. I even have my PhD advisor here. So I'm kind of nervous, to be honest, even though I graduated like almost 10 years ago. So today I'm going to talk a bit about generative UI, where the graphical interfaces and AI are sort of going. To be honest, me myself, I'm an ACI researcher. I don't have a very strong AI background, so I'm just going to be, I guess I'm just as perplexed as you. So I guess first thing I wanted to ask you, just by the round of applause, how tired, like, are you tired of AI news like every, like, for the past few years? Just can you? Well, sucks to be you because it's gonna be half an hour of this. I'm sorry about so we're gonna have more. Yeah, so, well, to be honest, I'm tired as well. You're gonna see it. I mean, it's crazy. What do I press next? Go down. Okay, perfect. So I would like to start with a phrase, may you live in interesting times. It's like an English saying. I've heard people say that it's actually ancient Chinese curse. This means like, may you live in troublesome times, or like, you know, may basically your life be troublesome. And we sort of live in interesting times. I keep thinking about it every time I see news, like every day. I'm like, it's quite interesting. We are living in a very, very interesting and strange times. So I guess if you've been following tech news lately, you've probably been seeing news about like Claude Code, all the coding agents. Then OpenClaw came out. It used to be called, was it ClaudeBot, and was like ModeBot and OpenClaw because Anthropic promised to sue them. And people are like, well, Anthropic is being mean, but actually maybe for a good reason, as you figure it out. I actually tried to look into, personally, I've been using it a lot. I work in between academia and industry. And industry, we've been also adopting AI coding agents quite a lot. And I looked up, there was a blog, I forgot the exact name of the blog, but basically somebody calculated that as of now, like about 4% of GitHub public commits are made by Claude Code. How do they know that? Because Claude puts himself as a co-author on your commits. So when you commit a code when it was written by Claude Code, it puts like, it's you and Claude. And it's like, oh, yeah, but it's kind of, I paid for it. Why do you put your name on it? Like, it's really annoying. Anyway, so this is pretty intense because GitHub is probably number one, the biggest platform for public code repositories, and 4% is a pretty big number for just one software tool that is out there. Which reminds me the terminology for hard takeoff or fast takeoff. Fast takeoff was, as far as I know, coined by Eliezer Yudkowsky, like maybe 10 or 20 years ago on Westrom. The idea is that basically at some point the sort of like the improvement of AI models becomes so fast that it becomes self-recursive, and biggest changes will be happening not in years, but in like days, minutes, seconds, and so on and so forth. There is this website called AI, I think AI Report or AI 2027, where basically there is like a group of authors that are saying, what are we going to see in the future? And to be honest, when I read that website like 2 or 3 years ago, I was like, well, 2027 is quite far away, but it's like tomorrow now. And what they're promising is that what we're seeing is just the beginning. In the nearest future, we're going to see more agentic interactions. They're promising like superhuman researchers, superhuman coders, artificial general intelligence, I mean, you name it. It's kind of crazy. They're promising us a very, really hard and fast takeoff that would erase your jobs, maybe erase the humanity as a whole. I don't know. But, and questions like, and? Like, what is that? I mean, I'm just a regular programmer slash researcher. I'm just a person. I don't really like work in one of those HI labs. So how does it impact me? And well, this is all crazy. Why should I care about it? And this is kind of like the questions that I ask every day, like, what now? And a lot of you might be actually familiar with this chart. So this is a famous like adoption cycle and hype cycle chart. It's used in analysis of technologies. When you're working with a certain technology, you probably know that there's like ups and downs. For example, famously in AI, there's this period that's called AI winter, where like the funding dried up and the AI research didn't really move along, and people are actually predicting that it might happen again soon. Or similarly, like if you saw like metaverse and AR, again, this happened just very recently. There was a lot of funding in it, a lot of adoption, and suddenly they're like, it's done. And they start firing people, stopping research, and so on and so forth. So here, if we look at actual adoption of coding agents and generative AI, I would probably say that we're still sort of like an early adopters, early majority phase, which is both good and bad news for us. Good news is it means that there's a lot we don't know, so we have a lot of room for improvement. And bad news because there's a lot we don't know, so we don't really know what's going to happen. Hopefully, things are going to be fine because, as you can see, there's also like a threat of disillusionment and other bad things that might happen. So we'll see. It's very interesting. As I told you, we live in interesting times. So when my first question would be like, what is UI? If I really simplify it, I guess whenever I work with graphical user interface as an engineer researcher, I could probably boil it down to the problem of data. And every time I build an interface, I have to over and over solve 3 problems. So UI is basically a problem of data visualization. How do I present the data to a user or a final user of that interface? How do I help them to navigate around the data? And how do I help them to manipulate? How do I help them interact with that? I remember one of my coworkers said that he's so tired of moving data from place A to place B forever, and he's been doing that for 30 years. And but to be honest, that is most of software engineering like it is, especially if you work with customer or product-facing applications. And if you look at history of UI, that is the story that repeats over and over. So graphical user interface started in the 70s with Xerox PARC, as we know. It was, I guess, I would call it sort of like bespoke applications or applications that were made, like it was very, very custom made, I guess, because the users were only trying to begin to understand what we're having, trying to understand metaphors and so on and so forth. But with the time progression, the interfaces become more complex because the users became more complex. The people who are using, there are more applications, more systems, more software. So there was sort of like push for unification and reduction of the cost and speeding up the production. I mean, if you work in programming, you know, like stuff like object-oriented programming, solid code, and all this kind of stuff. It also is being reflected in UI. And it is still happening right now, obviously. Of course, we have intelligent interfaces, adaptive interfaces that know what we're going to type. And right now, I guess people are sort of talking that we're going to have generative and agentic interfaces. I'm not exactly like confident that this is actually the term, but I like to adopt it for the sake of this presentation because it's an interesting topic to talk about. I call it the post-internet world, but it's an ironic name. Obviously, internet is not over, but there is an art movement called post-internet art movement where people are saying that since the internet is a commonplace thing rather than novelty these days, we're basically, it's sort of like, we can ironically call it the post-internet. We can integrate the internet interface and culture into our art. And if you look it up online, it's very interesting. So yeah, we have interfaces. And when researchers were actually trying to figure out what generative user interfaces are, I tried to look up the papers on this. And actually, not a lot of people are writing on it. We're still kind of trying to figure out what's going on. It's a relatively new topic. So I found one paper that was published last year where the author was trying to sort of like identify or make terminology or definition for a generative UI. So they said that generative UI is something that is made or adjusted or evolved through the generative process or generative practice that is using generative AI. And the AI system is contributing to the design and implementation of the interface. So for instance, we could have an AI model, do it independently, or co-create with the user, and so on and so forth. What is generative UI? So actually, there's a workshop happening at CHI this year. So for context, CHI is probably the biggest, the premier conference on human-computer interaction and interfaces. I'll be there this year. Hopefully, I got 3 papers. I have to show up. There's a workshop on it, and they had 3 interesting questions how to define the generative UI interface. So first of all, the question is the interface is constant or is it changing? Because it's very easy to regenerate the code or recreate the interface. And the generative interface that we get, is it the final product or is it going to be changing along with us? The second question is like, who is changing the interface? So what's interesting is that because now the systems are more autonomous, they can actually work as an independent co-creator along with the user. So the question is like, is the user asking for the change and the system provides them, or the system writes it on their own and presents it to the user, or they're working together? How is it going to work? And the third question is like, what is the interaction time frame? So because the generative AI and LMs are making the software and interface development so cheap, the interface instantly becomes disposable. So the question is the interaction going to be one time and then you forget and never see this thing again, or is it going to be over time, or is it going to be something else? So these 3 big questions are something that people are trying to sort of answer when they're studying generative AI as UI as a topic. And I'm just going to give you some examples of interface that you can try like right now, yesterday. This is like old news by AI standards right now. So disposable interfaces are sort of like one-shot interfaces that show up in different applications. The famous example is code artifacts. Gemini is called artifacts. In ChatGPT Pro, I think they called it Canvas, something. Yeah, I think it was Canvas. And anyway, who cares? But basically, the idea here is to provide you a convenient illustration for your data. When, for instance, it's usually some kind of JavaScript or web application that is being sprung up and being shown to you to quickly illustrate a point or help you to navigate against the obstacles of a pure chat interface that we usually see. Another one is something that is emerging, has been emerging recently for the past few years, maybe since 2024, is sort of like, I like to call it bespoke apps, but in reality, it's not really bespoke. So the idea is that you've probably seen a bunch of services like Valuable Virtual V0. There's like too many, like Figma Make. They're trying to say that, well, give me a screenshot or a description or a rough drawing of an app you want to make, and the UI will figure out what your app is going to look like. So for instance, here is a TL draw application that sort of like creates an application in real time based on your drawing. And I mean, at first, when you see it, it kind of looks like magic. But when you think about it, you're like, of course, it knows what a calculator looks like. It's seen like a million times, like in training data, a million examples of code for a calculator, so it can figure it out. But what's interesting is that it reducing the sort of like bar for entry for a user to create their own applications. And this is kind of like one interesting trend that is happening in generative UI. And a third one is that people have been talking a lot about. This is my personal assistant on Mac Mini that's running right now. Please don't break in, and it has API keys on it. So this is, people have been talking about agents, agentic programming, but what basically it came on to is that you have a sort of like an autonomous system that runs in a loop. You give it the request and full control of your system, and it can figure out and do things on its own. So like one of the, probably the most popular one is OpenCall, but there's a lot of other agents have been popping up. It's not exactly a new topic, but even though it's not exactly generative UI, but it is something that would be moving the change and the interaction between behind the generative interface in the nearest future. So yeah, how about that? So when we're talking about human-computer interaction and interfaces, it's a very overwhelming topic, and I would like to sort of kind of navigate around it using this diagram. This is actually a paper that was published by Jun Rikimoto, the famous Japanese computer scientist who works in ACI. And it was published in 2019, so it was like way before ChatGPT. But it's very useful. If you look at it, actually, what he's talking about is that you can put the interaction on whether the interaction with AI is invisible or is sort of behind the scene, or whether it has like a sort of self or agentic interaction, or is it autonomous? And what we're working here is actually this area right here is what I've been talking about today. So it's basically AI plus interfaces, agentic and intelligent systems. And there's a lot of research being done in this area, in others as well, but this is something that we've been dealing with day to day these days. So yeah, yeah, basically this is both good and bad news for us. OUI is generated, probably going to be generated in the nearest future. We've seen companies like Anthropic say that, well, most of our code right now is written by a model. We don't have like people coding now. Personally, in my company, I don't have data for you, but we've been adopting this very quickly. So a lot of tech companies are adopting this as well. So very soon, we're probably going to have a lot of automated workflows around it. And there's just nowhere to go. We're going to have like generated UI everywhere. And I have some good and bad news about it for you. So first of all, bad news. So actually, funny story. So this is an example of like some bad news I've seen like last week. Since then, at least like 5 even worse news happened. But what's interesting about generative UI is obviously it's a big security flaw. First of all, the models, like we have maybe like 4 big model providers right now that everybody's using. And it's like they're not very security conscious. So there's a lot of exposed API keys and so on and so forth. But other things are also very interesting. For instance, somebody found out that since Grok is being trained on Twitter, there's a guy who posts jailbreaks for models on Twitter. So accidentally, they train Grok on the jailbreaks that guy was posting, and turns out they're working on that model. And it's also lowering the bar for a lot of really dark activity, like, for instance, cybersecurity, red teaming testing, a lot of like tools that help you break stuff. They also automate a lot of things, like, for example, we have a lot of research being done on deceptive design, and it's very interesting, not just easy to make deceptive interfaces that are sort of like attacking users or in many different ways trying to get your money and so on and so forth. So very easy to commit crime when you're working with UI and generative UI. But I have more good news for you. But on the other thing is, we are sort of like entering era of customizable apps, as I was talking about a few slides ago. Basically, what is interesting for me here is that we're sort of like taking control over our digital spaces. So what's an example here is there's a phone company called Nothing Technologies. They just rolled out a tool where you can make custom apps for your phone, where you can just prompt it and say, I don't like the default apps you have. Can you make something different? And it makes an app for you. The sort of like bespoke interactions and interfaces is something that we'll have more on our phones or our device in the future. And especially it's useful when you have applications that are terrible, like banking applications or literally anything else, unsupported applications, so on and so forth, where you're just tired and you want something else, something that works for you, you are now capable of doing it. And also good news, this is actually a paper that my group published last year at Assets. Another thing is that generative AI and UI is very useful when you want to bridge the gap between the user and the technology. For example, my group has been working a lot on accessibility. Basically, we're helping people to have a better experience navigating online. And we had a study where blind users were trying to shop online and they were using screen readers. So modern websites, they're not made for a blind user in mind because, for instance, the elements are very deeply nested very deeply in the website. So, for instance, when you're using a screen reader, it takes like minutes to navigate to a button. And we thought, what if we are going to figure out how to prompt different models to rewrite the website in a way that will be more accessible? And we actually did, and we tested on like 30 real people, and they said, yes, it works. It actually helps. So in that case, generative UI is something that would help you to actually bridge the gap where the company just doesn't have money to help a person, or where a user can take over their space and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of also opportunity for good here. Finally, just a couple of words. So what is going to happen with UI as a whole? Well, the first thing is, I don't know. Nobody knows. It's a very new topic, so we're not really sure what we're going to see. I think two options would happen at the same time. We'll have overly personalized interfaces, and maybe we'll have overly depersonalized interfaces, because every app is trying to look like everybody else. It's sort of like carcinization of applications and GUI. I like this joke from Twitter where it's like a person names like completely nonsensical names for services, and you realize the joke is that they all look the same. And I suspect this is what we're going to see. We're going to see a bit of both. So it's going to be a very interesting future. Finally, also I would like to say that technology works in cycles. This is what's happening right now. We've probably seen it happening like 10, 20 years ago. This is, for instance, a demo by Jan LeCun from 1989, which was trained on a data set like this. I think the data set is from actually 94. But in either case, I mean, the demo that is shown here is not very different from what we do today. So the technology is sort of like coming back and going away all the time. So it's nothing to be really afraid about. And interfaces are not going away, it's just changing along with us as we become more complex, more different, and our needs are becoming different and more complex. And I think now it's time to be proactive and take control of our spaces and lives. So I guess for conclusion, I will say maybe finish time, but like maybe in a good way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And at this point, we're going to turn it over for Q&A. Who has any questions? Sorry. All right, I'm just going to go with the person closest to me.
So many questions. Thanks for the talk. It's quite provocative. So if I remember your slide, good news, apps can be personalized. Bad news is a giant attack surface and everyone will hack you. Why do we want this?
We don't want it. I mean, if I go back, I mean, this is what everybody's talking about. Like, with the technical debt is going to get really bad really fast. It's already, people are finding holes everywhere. So It's true. It's sorry, I don't have a direct answer for you. I'm also confused, like why people. I guess we'll have to figure out, especially how we work with code generation, and if we have more, I guess, checks and security changes around it. But I don't think so. Yeah, sorry, I don't. Oh.
How to use this? I wanted to ask a question about training. So I noticed that even with the existing interfaces, there's this problem that it's often hard to describe what exactly is uncomfortable about some given application or some given anything, some new device. And it looks like it's very hard to, it has to do with physical interaction with your computer, with your phone, which is something that you cannot really express. Like, you know that your finger movement, your keyboard shortcuts can be convenient or inconvenient. And this is something that you cannot, like if you are a software developer, you can of course test your application and understand, oh, okay, it doesn't feel nice. But sort of the current data sets don't contain this. We don't have any way to access how it's going to feel. Do people ever think about it? Do people think?
I mean, this is kind of an interesting topic in HCI actually, because on one hand, yes, you're right. It's pretty hard to, I guess, simulate a person, but actually, people have been trying very hard to do that. Actually, there's been some studies, or it was the past years, where people have been using LMs for UX research, where they simulated, like for instance, user behavior or person behavior. So technically, up to like, from what I read, up to 70%, you can sort of automate it faithfully. But I don't know. I mean, probably they didn't test enough. But it's a good question in the sense that yes, there of course almost every interface is being A/B tested, especially if talking about research papers and research. We usually go through different validation stages. There's usually even like before you do the development, you do full formative study and so on and so forth. So on my side, yes, we're testing, but yes, in the future is going to be a big question because, for instance, again, 3D interactions are going to be big problems. Like Moravec's paradox is still around; it hasn't been really solved, so we don't really know what's going to happen.
Pretty dark.
Well, thank you very much. This way, okay. Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to ask how is there any researches and expectations about future of user behavior in the development of AI?
Yes, there's actually quite a lot of work on this. There's like multiple disciplines within HCI that are looking into it. First of all, like how we talk, a lot of people are starting adopting speech patterns that are common for generative AI models like ChatGPT. Even I think in my slides, I like the second phrase is not going away. It's not A, it's B. It's like what ChatGPT likes to write. I wrote it and I was like, I wrote it with my own hands. Why did I do that? But aside from that, actually, yes, there's a lot of opportunity for like sort of like deception, different sorts of like simulations. For instance, there's a way to deceive users online using models. There's dead internet theory, and yes, there's a lot of work being done on this. I'm sorry I don't have the direct answer for you right now, but it is a big concern in the CI community. It's something that we've been discussing about for the past few years. On the bright side, though, we've been also, especially in Japanese community, been active around the topic of human-computer integration. So, for instance, if we have wearable or implantable interfaces, how are we going to work with them? If they're going to be intelligent, how are we going to coexist with them, so on and so forth. So there's work being done in both directions, both, I guess, in utopian and dystopian worldview.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much.
I just want to comment like only one thing. I'm working at an American semiconductor company focused on the AI security. Your presentation is like the best presentation I ever seen in this year. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yep. Okay. I'm just wondering how, as far as like AI and UI is concerned, where are we currently? Like how real it is? For example, on the coding side, we see that this, like you were saying, sort of 4% of commits are happening using Claude. But where are we on the UI side? Where is it still at a potential stage where people find interesting stuff and think what can be done, or are people being able to use it in a meaningful manner as of today? So just curious.
Sorry, could you please explain a little bit more? So in the sense that
In the sense like UI, like
is there still room
AI-based
for-
UI, yeah, or agents, are people being able to use this in a meaningful manner as of today on
see.
implementation, live in production type of thing?
I see. Well, first of all, yeah, agents. There's a big question of how much, how useful they are actually. What I've heard a lot is like people install OpenClaw, but they don't really know what to do with it, and especially for coding. Like people are like, I keep prompting, but I don't really know what to use the code. But in terms of interactions, there's actually a lot of interesting opportunities here. Personally, for instance, I am personally excited about proxemic interaction. This is a sort of a field within ACI where the interaction with the system depends on the distance between people. So if I, for instance, stand close to the slide deck or far away, the question is how do we build interactions that help people, for instance, exchange the data? And autonomous agents could be super handy here in the sense that of fast interactions or some kind of like protocol-based interactions between the objects that were not initially built as one system. I don't know, there's also like a lot of other interesting things you could try, especially with vision models and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity for growth, at least for me. But again, for everyday user right now, I don't really know. There's a lot of use aside from writing essays or code.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, I hope I answered your questions.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, sorry. This working? Okay, so it's quite interesting. And thank you for the presentation first. It's quite interesting the idea of generating user interface, but I'm quite still confused about the differentiations between using AI to code, which is already, we already know that AI is very good at coding, and using AI for generating UI. It feels to me that AI for UI is just AI for code with pretty boxes. So what are the differentiations between the already given AI for coding with the ones that you're interested, the fields that you're interested in, which is the AI for UI?
That's a very good question. I guess if I could rephrase it, it would probably be AI for front-end or generative front-end. In this case, however, when we're talking about user interactions, I mean, we can go further than graphical user interfaces. For instance, the next task would be question, how do we build generative tangible user interfaces, where we build 3D objects or print objects and so on and so forth. Or how do we, well, mostly tangible interface would probably be robotics or wearables and so on and so forth. But yes, it's a good question here. If you look even past on the previous like terminology like adaptive UI and intelligent UI, it's also basically a code with a graphic device on it. So it's not very different from what we have today. I guess the way we're trying to talk about generative AI is to just distinguish between the stuff that was sort of written by an actual person before and the stuff that is being like generated over and over these days, so that we have a little bit of distinction behind the authorship of the interface, other than the way it's done. At least that's the way I would try to explain it to a reviewer of a paper.
Sure. Well, and there's a human interaction part as well that's
Yes.
not always there for Thank you.
Okay, so my concern with this user interface generated is that my advertisement blocker might not work anymore. So when you go to a UI conference, do people ever talk about this, or do you have any comments on this?
The advertisement?
Advertisement like blocker, or like, so it can be perhaps considered as like accessibility utility, and I wonder that if it's so over personalized, it might be kind of counter to the utility of those things. So
I see. Well, I mean, your block is probably the training data, so people might read it that way. But yeah, I don't have a straight answer for you. I also don't know. I guess maybe if I had a blog and I had problem with internet access and advertisement, I would probably move to Substack or another platform. But it is a sort of difficult question, especially in the age where the internet is kind of flooded with the swap website and the internet of swap. So yeah, sorry, I'm not sure. I'm not really good at web advertisements. I don't have an answer for you here.
okay, thank you.
Answer the question.
Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on the balance for UI or human HCI of like personalization or accessibility versus repeatability, right? LLMs by nature are non-deterministic.
Yes.
And there's a portion of UI that like the benefit of good design is that it's expected, right, to the user. And if LLMs 99% of the time, maybe they can generate the right one, but the 1% of the time they generate something that you don't expect, causes friction, causes pain, right?
Yes.
Kind of curious, like what's the sense of the community on where that balance lies?
That's a very good question for another workshop. Good question. I guess just my 2 cents here would be, first of all, one thing what I've seen on tech Twitter, people have been talking about like having taste or building like tasteful interface and tasteful interactions. And then people have been like mocking it, saying that people who say have taste they have no taste. So it's a bit tough to kind of like, I guess, build good design that is actually optimized for people. It's very easy to churn out the interfaces that are kind of like the same and they annoy people and so on and so forth. I guess what's interesting in terms of generative interfaces is that since the sort of like friction between creating the interfaces and the code is so low and the cost is so low, at least what we can do is we can repeatedly A/B test and keep trying to build the best interface for a user. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I think that's right. But I was curious. I didn't see you talk about it. I think there's actually like a delta, or there's 2 types of generative UI. There's the one that's generated and permanent. So you generate code and then that UI is permanent until you regenerate it again. Versus more where I think some of the generative UI is it's generated on the fly in response to a user loading the page or the app or something like that.
I've been I could only give like 3 examples, but yes, that is true. If you look at the time frame of traction, we could build either final interface or the one that would be changing along with the user. And it is something that people are studying right now. What's interesting out of studies that I've seen is that because generation of media is, again, very cheap, there's very interesting personalizing stuff that you can do about it, like having, like, for instance, auditory or imagery that would work together with the user, or I don't know, like in some studies, for instance, you could copy the like user's voice, so on and so forth. But yeah, I don't have a direct answer for you here, unfortunately. But this is something that we need to look more into and figure out how we test and how we build these interfaces. I guess yeah, please come to Kai this year, and I signed up for that workshop myself. I want to know. Yeah, sorry, I have more questions for you than answers today. I'm also very confused by this topic and perplexed, and so very interesting features that we're seeing.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one last one. Someone who hasn't asked a question yet tonight, because we got a lot of repeats. Was that? All right. Yeah. Oh, actually, yeah. Melvin should ask a question. I was going to run. Okay, mute me because I'm going to run past the speaker. Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah. You really don't hold it pointing at the speaker. That's the problem.
I forgot the speakers over there. Speaker versus speaker. Okay. So going back kind of that to that sense of the disposable on-the-fly generated UI. So like on the corollary with the how it could help like hard of seeing users navigate websites better, one can imagine that the on-the-fly generated UI would reduce the number of choices down to what is optimized or what is optimal to the current interaction. But at the same time, could that not be I wouldn't say how to say kind of like almost a dark pattern, kind of like limiting the agency of the user. Whereas a static interface, you know that there are other options other than those that are presented to you. So how can we seek to balance that in this age of like, essentially like you mentioned, disposable generation?
One thing I've seen in papers over and over is people are trying to go through the route of co-creation, whereas the interfaces make like AI and user collaborate together. There's different ways. Either the user is prompting. Another interesting possibility is that if you have enough information about the user, you don't even need the user to express the intent. You can sort of guess what they want. So there's, I guess, sort of different ways where you could push user for more collaboration or co-design opportunity where you create a sort of best option for them. The question is whether it's financially like doable for most products and companies, but on the research side, it is very much possible. There's one more person and.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. Give another hand of applause.
Thank you.
Squeeze by here. And we're just about ready to wrap up for the evening. Let's see if I can. There we go. Nope. Okay, so we're just about ready to wrap up for the evening. Just another reminder, our next event will be right here on March 20th. I hope you all will come back. I won't harass you again about this for a month. And finally, we have thank yous to go through. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to all of us for being here for our first event here at Study Abroad Pub. As you can see, we had some new things we had to learn. We had to learn how to use the sound system. We had to learn how to operate everything. And most of all, we're just overwhelmed by the amount of support, the number of people who came here tonight. And of course, if you come back next month, I promise we will have all the seats set up in time. We won't have to scooch everyone forward and everything now that we know. We're so happy to see so many people here. So I have a list of thank yous for the evening. Thank you, of course, to Andrew for putting all this together, all of the sound and effects and everything, and panicking. Thank you to Melvin, to Daria, to Gray, Selena, Coco, Kay, anyone who helped us set up chairs at the beginning, and I really hope you'll stay afterwards to help us strike the chairs. To Study Abroad Pub for hosting us. Thank you so much to our speakers for making this possible and for sharing all this information with us. And finally, thank you to you, the audience, and have a great night.
The presentation, I understood the list. Would you let me check
some pictures of two slides of two images that he makes. So I will study them. Which one? The one what is it's like a really funny words of Twitter, I suppose. The tweet to somebody, and the one with that is the graphic of
Maybe you should ask Bektur, and you can share the